Let's give him a big round of applause.
If you heard a roar of joy Friday, it was because I finished one of the projects that I didn't need to be working on my sabbatical. I undertook about a year ago a translation project. There's a multi-volume standard reference work in German. It's the Theologische Wörterbuch zum Alten, the theological dictionary of the Old Testament. And it's a 10-volume daily Bible. And it was begun before I was a student and began appearing in English from translating into German when I was a college student. And here it is, 6 or 7 years later now. And the last volume, which is on the Aramaic section of the Old Testament, was assigned to me to translate. And I have to go over the last section and make sure I have all my commas straight. But I finished the last word Friday at about 11:30. And I didn't do anything else the rest of the day much. I said, except to go.
Watch Clemson.
No, I did not watch
Clemson.
I felt light, sort of, the rest of the day, as though some burden had been lifted. And now I can turn to the next thing I have to do before I turn to my sabbatical project. So it'll get there eventually. But it did. I will say it was translating. I did my doctorate in Switzerland, so I've done a good bit of translating. I hate it. It's mindless work. But people come to me all the time and say, so here was the dictionary. This volume required you to be able to, you have to know Aramaic, and you have to know German, and you have to know how German talks about Aramaic, and then you have to know Akkadian and Syriac, those things, and then translate that into English so that someone who knows Aramaic and Syriac and Akkadian. And so they said, so who but you? And I said, oh. So who? And I said, how much are you paying? I said, well, what do you think it's worth? And I, for the first time in my life, I jacked it up way beyond what I thought it was they would pay. And they said, okay. Yeah. So then I said, well, darn, I guess I'll have to do this. So I finished the project, and I feel great, I'll tell you. But I've got to reorient myself. I have this weekend, this afternoon, I'll sit down and think, okay, what's my plan of attack now? Because I have to get stuff done. And speaking of getting stuff done, we're going to finish the United Monarchy today. We're going to deal with Solomon. And I want you to, if you haven't gotten the impression already, I think many of us come to the Bible expecting it to be monolithic, is that a right word? Expecting it to be have a one viewpoint on things and on people. David's a hero, or he's a scoundrel. Which one? Well, yes, he is a hero and a scoundrel. Yeah, and both and. And I think it surprises us when we discover that the Bible, the biblical authors can do that, and they can do that, and not only can they, but they do. And even more than David, the biblical portrayal of Solomon is, what shall we say, bipolar. He's known as we begin reading about him in 1 Kings chapter 2, especially around verse 5, when after his father has had him anointed as the next king, David advises Solomon on how he should conduct business as king. And rather than give him a lot of policy advice, he says, follow the Lord. And you need to watch out for. And he lists everybody who was on Absalom's side during the rebellion. He lists especially Joab. I want to read what he said about Joab. Moreover, you know also what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me. How he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether, whom he murdered, retaliating in time of peace for blood that had been shed in war. And he goes, remember, that's way back before David had become king of the north, when Abner helped David get to begin. Joab killed him, and David said, I don't like that. I wish you hadn't done that. Now, all the way at the end of his life, after Joab is murdered and Uriah the Hittite, Absalom's David's son, and a whole bunch of other people at the end of David's life. All of that was very useful to David, right? He may not have liked it, but it was useful to him. And the first thing he said to Solomon was, you've got to get rid of Joab. He said, and watch out for your brother Adonijah, and that little sneak Shimei, you've got to watch out for him. And he lists off a whole bunch of people and basically says, Solomon, first chance you get rid of them. And I don't mean, exile them. And so the first part of the Solomon story is a tale of how one by one, let's take Shimei, for example. He had been a supporter of Absalom during his rebellion. And Solomon told Shimei, he said, okay, I want you to move to Jerusalem and build a house next door to mine. And I want you to stay there. If you ever leave Jerusalem, you're done for. So you have to think of this guy who had a popular following out about. David's going to keep him next door. Well, several years pass, and he hears that back on his estate, something has gone wrong, and he goes to see about it. And Solomon says, oh, see there? Told you not to leave. You left. And he has Joab. Before he has Joab. Joab. First, it's messy business. I mean, messy business. But then we get down to the tale where is this? Chapter 3. We start discovering who Solomon is going to be as king. Now, this is easy to remember. I teach my students 3 good things and 3 bad things. Okay? Let's look at the 3 good things. You know some of them. Solomon is known especially for his wisdom. Chapter 3, verse 3, while Solomon begins to tell, while Solomon was at Gibeon offering a sacrifice, he prayed to the Lord there and asked for wisdom, and God said, I'm glad you asked for that. That's a good thing to ask for. I'm going to give it to you. And then we have that story we all know about the 2 prostitutes. Both of them had sons. One of them died. Both of them claimed the survivor. And what did Solomon do? Yeah, and the one who is the real mama said, oh, don't do that. Let her have him. And Solomon said, okay, you're clearly the mother. That's how wise he was. Later on, we hear about how he had a zoo, basically, and botanical gardens, and books, and he studied, and he learned, and he classified. He was a great taxonomist, and really smart guy. The Queen of Sheba heard how smart he was, came to see, and said, yep, he's that smart. So Solomon was wise. He was also a good administrator. Now, we know this about Saul, the first king, that he never even had a capital city, right? And certainly didn't have any kind of administrative structure. David, we read about, had like 4 or 5 guys to run things. Solomon seems to have studied Egyptian governmental practices. Chapter 4, verse 1. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Azariah, son of Zadok, was the priest. Elihoshaphat and Ahijah, sons of Shishak, were secretaries. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Azariah, son of, and it goes on. Right? He set up a real administrative structure with even 12 divisions, something like governors over each of the 12 tribes. They functioned in part as tax collectors. We'll talk about that in a minute. He was also a magnificent builder. This is probably the thing the Bible celebrates in him most. What did he build? He was the one who finally built the temple. What else did he build? He really expanded the palace. He built storehouses. Let's see, let me see if I can find, there's a nice summary of everything he built somewhere. Here you go. Here we go. Oh boy, chapter 7. I'll skip around. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. He made the hall of pillars, the hall of the throne, the house where the treasury was supposed to be held. He built storehouses, and let me see, there's another summary of this. Oh yeah. Let's see, this is chapter 9. Good Lord, what didn't he build? Let's go now. There we go. page. I have to stick my tongue out. Okay, there we go. Okay, he built the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milo and the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo and Gazer, whole cities. Lower Beth-Horon, Baalat, Tamar in the wilderness, all of Solomon's storage cities, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. So he built garrisons, fortresses, army outposts, whole cities. Yes, is that a question?
Someone was talking yesterday about slave labor.
Right.
And obviously the Phoenicians used slave labor.
Right.
The Egyptians used slave
Right.
labor.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. That's one of the three bad things. One of the three bad. So let's review. He was wise. He was a good administrator. And he built a lot of really good infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. What are the bad things? Well, probably what he's most famous for not doing well is how he conducted his foreign policy. And he did that by marrying foreign princesses. Chapter 3, verse 1. Even before anything else is told, it says, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high. And I won't bother to read those texts because you know this also. How many wives and concubines did he have? 1,000 in total, I think it was. And they were mostly princesses and stuff. And he had the bad habit of, if he married an Egyptian princess, he will build her a chapel there on the palace temple grounds so that she could continue to worship her God. So here's the king of Israel, and before it's over with, he will have built palaces to Canaanite gods and Egyptian gods and Mesopotamian gods scattered all around the palace grounds there.
The only ones up front.
all around the palace grounds there for his wives to continue worship. Now, think about that for a minute. How do you think that the biblical authors think about the king of Israel building chapels for all of the foreign gods around him so that his many, many wives could worship there? Well, the biblical authors don't like it one little bit. That's how that goes. Because it's introducing into Israel the very thing that you're not supposed to have in Israel, which is idolatry and polytheism. So, I remember growing up hearing about him and all his wives, and I thought, golly, what a womanizer he was. No, this was all politics. Right? Second thing he's known for being bad is that in all of his building, I'm reading now 1 Kings 5, verse 13. To build all these cities, King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. This passage goes on to tell later how he provisioned you've got 1,000 wives. How he provisioned the palace, and it was by dividing up the people into 12ths. That's one tribe a year, and they had to supply all the food and stuff for the palace in their money. Now this is important for two reasons. One is the term used here, and it's used 3 or 4 times. I translated forced labor. Is exactly the term used of Pharaoh when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and it's the same term Samuel used back when they said, we want a king, and he said, I don't want to give you one, and God said, give them one anyway, but warn them. And Samuel said, yes, the day will come when your king will take, remember, and him saying that, take this, take that, and he will put you in, and uses the word translated here, forced labor. So, in essence, Solomon now has become, at least in the eyes of the people, he's acting more like Pharaoh than he is their own king. Yes?
Did they have no slave labor at all until?
You know what? No, I mean, all right. Yeah, let's talk about this a minute. It's important to distinguish between what we think of as slavery in our country from our history and what slavery was like in the ancient world. We have the history of thinking of slavery in terms of a race of people, right? Not in the ancient world. You became a slave one of two or three ways, usually because you were captured in war. And the ancient didn't care. A Greek would make another Greek a slave and not think anything of it. A Roman would enslave a Roman, an Israelite would enslave an Israelite. That wasn't about race, it was about your bad luck. The other way was by going into debt, and you could end up a slave that way. This is not technically slavery. This is forced labor. In other words, it'd be more like compulsory service, right? You had to work for the king a month a year. That's all there was to it.
Did they get paid?
No. And they had to leave things at home, right? So you can imagine, by the way, this is more than any other thing, what ended the United Monarchy. One of the people in charge of this during under Solomon, was a fellow by the name of Jeroboam. Oh, wait a minute. Let me do the other thing he was bad at, and then we'll read the text that have to do with this. The other thing he was bad at is generaling. He did not have a good military mind. And all of those places that David conquered, almost all of them were free by the end of Solomon's reign. So that, he lost Moab, he lost Ammon, he lost Edom, he lost Syria. He didn't lose Philistia, but he lost pretty much, and he kept Ziklag in Jerusalem, of course. But he lost all those territories that his father had conquered because he wasn't good at it. Didn't know what he was doing when it came to military might. We know that David actually fought. No record of Solomon ever taking the battlefield. He just didn't. He was a book learned man. He wasn't rough and rugged. He could administrate. He could architecture, right? But he couldn't fight. Now, I start saying, this forced labor is in fact what brings the United Monarchy down. Solomon had in charge of that project, a fellow by the name of Jeroboam. Jeroboam himself began to be unhappy with this forced labor stuff, and ended up rebelling a little bit and having to go to Egypt to stay alive. Before he left, or on the way kind of, there's a prophet named Ahijah who came to Jeroboam and said, yep, Solomon has messed up, in effect. Because God promised David that one of his descendants would always be king in Jerusalem, God is not going to take the monarchy away from Solomon and his descendants, not entirely. But God is going to take away 10/12 of it, the northern tribes. And Ahijah does this thing about ripping something off somebody's robe and saying, this is going to tear me something. And he said, Jeroboam, you're going to be the one who becomes king over the 10 northern tribes. But right now, you better get out of here. And so he goes and hides in Egypt. Later on then, when Solomon has died and Rehoboam, his son, remember that David entered into sort of a treaty relationship with the northern tribes. Remember that? They made a covenant. When Solomon dies, the northern kingdom representatives of the north want to meet with Rehoboam and discuss the terms of their treaty or their covenant relationship. And what they want is a slackening off on this. They say to him, your dad built all the garrisons, we have all the forts, and we have all the treasuries, and we have all the storage facilities, and we have all that big palace of yours and that nice temple, got roads and everything. Can we quit this stuff? And will you lay off us a little bit? And we call this, by the way, Rehoboam's folly. He has two sets of advisors, the oldsters who had been his dad's counselors, and they say to him, they have a point. Might be a good time now to show your magnanimity and say, you're right, Dad pushed you a little hard, but look what all wonderful things we've got done. Now that we've got them done, we can afford, to lay off and live off what we built. The youngsters who he grew up with, say to him, "Oh, this is a test of your manhood. They're pushing your authority. You got to tell them that they thought Solomon was tough." And he says that they meet the next day after he's thought about it, and he tells the representatives of the northern 10 tribes, "My father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions."
Did
And
he
they-
tweet about it?
Huh? What now?
Did he tweet?
Yeah, he probably tweeted that. Yeah, next morning. And the representatives of the 10 northern tribes said, "No, you won't." And they anointed Jeroboam, who had showed up again, king, and that's the end of the united monarchy. Thereafter, we have Judah in the south, Israel in the north. Yes.
I think I missed it. Are Rehoboam and Jeroboam brothers?
No.
Oh,
No,
okay.
no, no. It just happened to be a popular way to name people. What does Jeroboam mean? I have to think a minute. Jeroboam. It has something to do with being great. Jeroboam does. Rehoboam. Oam is just an ending, like Johnson and help me with another, Davidson. Would you say, "Oh, are Johnson and Davidson brothers? They're both sons." No, that's an ending.
Watson.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the most important son.
A Jeroboam is a really big wine bottle.
By the way, Jeroboam, the Bible doesn't like him. Jeroboam the first. He has a problem. The temple and the palace of David are both in Jerusalem. And the Israelites, when they go to worship, they're going to go where to worship? To Jerusalem, where right there where the Davidic palace is, the Davidic king. It's going to be hard to keep their loyalty politically if their religious loyalty is to Jerusalem. Right? So to avoid that, he establishes sanctuaries in Dan in the far north and Bethel, which is just across the border in the south of Israel, just north of Jerusalem, and put golden calf statues there. Right? And that's the whole history of that.
Where do Ahab and Jezebel fit in?
Ahab and Jezebel are about 150 years, 150 years later.
Oh, later.
Yeah.
Wasn't he a king?
Ahab was a king in the north.
Oh, okay.
In the north.
That's right. You said this was the end of the.
Yeah, I mean, when you read, beginning somewhere with 1 Kings about chapter 11 or 12, for the rest of 1 Kings and all of 2 Kings, it's very confusing. Because the task is to tell this tale of the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, that's 2 kingdoms, right? And so how do you do that? Well, you tell the tale of the northern kingdom until that king dies, and you go back and tell the southern kingdom until you get caught up, and then you jump back, and it's like this back and forth all the way. And it's very difficult to keep straight, right? Who you're talking about. All of the southern kings are descendants of David, all the northern kings. Well, in the north they had 2 periods of non-dynastic rule, and then they had 2 dynasties that lasted 100 years each or something.
So the 10 tribes are in the north?
North, yes. And we call them Israel.
Right.
And the 2 southern tribes we call
Judah.
Judah. Okay, now, I've got Solomon for you. This forced labor business is huge I want to read, by the way, by comparison now, the only place in the Torah that talks about kings, and it's Deuteronomy chapter 17. We call this the law of the king. And I want you to see whether or not, I mean, it's almost, well, see what you notice. I can't seem to turn the page today without turning too many. All right.
Did you say 12?
17. Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you, who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. Now, many of us think that return the people to Egypt doesn't mean take them back into Egyptian exile. It means return them to the conditions of Egypt. And what were those conditions? Forced labor. Right. In order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you must never go that way again. Right. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law, written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandments, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel. Who does it sound like that was written about? Saul. Yeah. Why does the Torah not want the king of Israel not to have many horses? What are horses for?
War army.
And why should the king of Israel not rely on an army? Because the king of Israel should rely on And what does Solomon do? He builds fortresses and garrisons, and has horses and cavalries and the whole shmear, and marries a bunch of wives. It's like he was known throughout the region for the grandeur of his court, but having a grand court with a lot of military power and political alliances was not the kind of thing that the God of Israel wanted the king of Israel to be interested in. Not by might nor by horses, but by right. This is illustrated again in Isaiah chapter 7, and that passage with Ahaz is much later, when Ahaz is afraid of a military alliance that's being formed against him. God tells Isaiah to tell Ahaz just to do nothing, just wait. God will take care of it. Don't be afraid. You don't have to do anything. I've got this on your hand. Well, what did Ahaz do? He appealed to the Assyrians in Mesopotamia, the empire, for assistance, and they gave it to him and then made him a vassal. So he lost his independence. And Isaiah said, I told you not to do that. Right. There you go again. You can't have confidence in God. You want to put your confidence in military might. Now, I have to say that kings and presidents, they have armies. And they look at them and think, what do I have this army for if I'm not going to use it? That's a temptation. I've got this army.
So somebody else.
My general tell me, I quake every time I hear him say that. Mind you, they're not your general.
But somebody else has an army too.
Yeah, I know, and that's why. But there we are. I mean, in the world we live in, that's our temptation. I mean, I can only imagine what would happen if some conflict. If some preacher told our current president not to worry about North Korea or Iran, that God is going to look at it. That might be authentic, but if the current president or any president of the United States, either party, were to stand up in front of microphones and say, the Lord has told me to count on God, and we're not doing diddly squat, he would be impeached the next day, or she, and I don't care what party it is, because the Congress of the United States, the people of the United States would say, but we have this big army.
When the nuclear missile heads over this way.
Anyway, let's recap the whole thing. The United Monarchy period is, in the eyes of the rest of the Bible, sort of a, it's a founding era for the nation of Israel, as a nation, right? And as a nation, Israel existed then, if you want to count all the way down to the end of Judah, for about 400 and something years, right? And then that was it. And if you extrapolate all the way out to the end of the book, of 2 Kings, the Deuteronomistic history, it continues to make the point that the weaknesses inherent in the monarchy, evident already under those halcyon days of David and Solomon, those weaknesses persist and ultimately bring about the end of the nation of Judah, or the nation of Israel. And I'll remind you that until 1947, Israel never again existed as a nation. And when it was refounded in 1947, it was not founded under a Davidic monarch, right? And it is not, though they try to make it into one, Israel is not a religious state per se. You can be an Arab Muslim and be a citizen of the state of Israel. In fact, there are many who are. And most Israeli citizens are Jewish by heritage, but not by religious practice. It's a very secular state. I don't know if you knew that, but it is. So to say that the nation of Israel exists in the way in which it did in biblical days is just not true. And I wish more Protestant, especially evangelical Christians, knew that and would acknowledge it. Things would be better for everybody. But be that as may, you've got this 3-king period, and the trouble already begins. And the trouble is this tendency to, well, let's say, overtax, and I don't mean that just monetarily, the people. This tendency to associate the king and his throne, the well-being of the king and the well-being of the people are not necessarily the same thing. The interests of the king are not necessarily in the interest of the people. When the kings make bad decisions, and they do frequently, who pays for it? The people. We're supposed to be monotheist, but when someone like Solomon builds chapels for foreign gods for his many wives, how is he going to say then to the people, be sure and be faithful to God only? He can't, can he? When you go to the temple and you have to pass by a chapel to a Mesopotamian god on the way up the steps, it's hard to think that really being monotheist is our job, our purpose, our true value. So when we come down to the end and the Babylonians come in and tear down Jerusalem, Jeremiah's there to say, this traces back. We've always had a fundamental flaw at the core of our monarchy, or a series of fundamental flaws at the core of our monarchy. Yes?
So where does monotheism or Christianity intolerance come in?
Well, I mean, it's one thing to say, you're a Canaanite and you worship your God, I think mistakenly. And it's another thing to say, I'm a monotheist and I'm going to be, I mean, you all don't have, little booths to various other religions here on the campus of your church, so that passersby can, if they want to, step in and, you don't, that's not your value, right? You at least believe what you say you believe enough not to undermine that in your architecture, right? You can tolerate somebody else's. I mean, I'd like to think that y'all would say if somebody wanted to build a mosque or on the next corner, you'd say, we'll be good neighbors, right? But you don't say, put a chapel in here right next to ours in this building, right? It's not the same thing. I want to comment. One of the things that because I know what comes after this period. One of the questions that this whole thing poses, and it begins already in the book of Judges, and it's a question that we still struggle with. And that is the question of to what extent do you identify a system of government as divinely ordained? Did you hear what I just said? Remember that at the end of the book of Judges, there's that comment made 3 times. In those days, they had no king. They did whatever was right. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, that gives you the impression that being led by a judge, a charismatic leader, who God would raise up as a deliverer when you were in trouble, that has a certain, sounds dynamic anyway. And it kind of works. But the book of Judges tells us every time that happened, Israel was staying out for a while, and then that judge would die, and pretty soon Israel had lapsed back into idolatry, right? And they got in trouble again, and then God raises up another judge. And so when the people say to Samuel, we want a king like everybody else, in part what they're saying is, we need continuity. I mean, we just need somebody in charge all the time, instead of this wait until we're in trouble, having this cycle over and over and over and over again. Well, okay, that makes sense. We'll have a divinely ordained and, undergirded monarchy. That'll take care of it. No, it won't. I mean, we thought, no, by the time we come to the end of 2 Kings, we discover, no, it's not working either. Right? And that's when, thereafter, Judaism becomes not a nation anymore, but a religious community. And we discover with the Jews living in the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, they found ways to be a religious community and have their religious identity as a people of God, and yet be like Daniel and work for the Persian king, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Cooperate with the government, which is not Israelite, does not uphold Israelite values, but it's the government. So we can go along with it unless it tells us, I'm thinking of Daniel again, to worship a statue. And then we say, thank you very much, and we go upstairs into our prayer room and we pray as we do every day, and your enemies who thought that's what you would do, trap you and you get thrown in a lion's den. Right? So there's a certain, I will be loyal to this government unless it asks me to be disloyal to my faith. So, and now we have democracy, which is, an innovation of our kind of the last several centuries. And I'm going to go, this is not something the Bible says, this is me extrapolating from the Bible, and you're fully empowered in every right you have to disagree with me on this. But I don't think democracy is God ordained either. It has flaws like you, if you don't believe it, then watch the news this evening. Democracy, first of all, we don't have a democracy, but we have a representative republic. And so I don't know, I would say that representative republicanism doesn't work well, always. I don't know what a democracy would be like. The founding fathers of our country were scared to death of a democracy, and for good reason. But as a Christian, now here you're about to hear the Baptist in me come out. But it's not just the Baptist in me, it's all of this we've been talking about. Right? I am not willing to identify so firmly with a government or a system of government that I'm not always going to be skeptical of its motives. My allegiance, my primary allegiance, is to God. Jeremiah said, seek the welfare of the city. As long as I am an American and love America, which I do, I am going to want America to do well and be good. But I am not going to obey its every whim. It is not my Lord. Right. And I think the book of the Deuteronomistic history and the United Monarchy go a long ways to teaching us those principles. And now, I have said my say and have left, I think, a 15, 20 minutes.
Got 15 minutes.
See, I'm not gonna do it. I've been
You
teaching.
might be sorry.
I've been teaching for 4 or 5 years, and I've got it down. When I get back to work, it's about like in my 32nd year in the classroom. I know how to do this. Or listen, if I don't have it down now, I'm never gonna get it. Yes.
I was listening to what you just said, and you did hit on an answer to this question, but I'd like to be broadly generalistic and say that I believe people in America have a responsibility to learn our history, understand our culture, understand our government. I find the New Testament is being divergent from what we've been talking about the last 3 weeks, because the New Testament, there's every other chapter, there's a new challenge for what we are to do and how we can be better people, and things the guy next door can do, things I can do to be better Christians and followers of God. You drop back into this story of the kings and the kings and the kings and the kings, and I sometimes lose interest. I mean, you make it exciting and lively, but I don't find myself reading the Old Testament as much as maybe I should, because I don't get the point of, why are we supposed to look at what the king did and extrapolate from that what our society should do? And, is my time better spent with the New Testament? And help me understand how to appreciate this whole
Okay, I will. Point of fact, you just described what is sort of my life's call, I think. When I was a college student in the seminary, I approached it the same way you do. Well, I think most Christians do. I thought the Old Testament was kind of dull, a little bit dry, and a lot of names, and you couldn't pronounce them. You couldn't keep the history straight. A lot of stuff didn't seem relevant to me. And by the time I finished my MDiv and was thinking about what to do graduate work in, one of my professors called me in, Paige Kelly of blessed memory. But you have these moments in life that are just, seminal for the rest of your life. And he dropped a note in my mailbox for me to come see him. Now, that scared the jeebers out of me, because I didn't know he knew my name. And I thought, oh Lord, what have I done, or what does he think I've done that I haven't done? And so I didn't have to knock it. My hand was shaking so much, I just held it up at the door. And he had pulled all my transcripts, and he had a series of questions for me. Are you considering graduate school? And I said, yes, I am. He said, good. What discipline are you considering? And I said, well, and I was trying to think market-oriented. I wanted a job after it was over. I think maybe there aren't as many ethicists as the academy needs, and I'm thinking about ethics, or maybe church. And he said, I notice here that all the way back to college, whenever you had the opportunity to take an elective, a free one, it was in Bible, and mostly, he said, in Old Testament. And that was true, because I had a series of teachers who do what I'm doing. And before I knew it, what about the Old Testament really gets me going? One is that it's grounded in the world and in the earth. It deals with politics, it deals with, it's not just, and I'm not diminishing this. Paul will wax rhapsodic about the breadths and depths and heights and lengths of God's overarching love for all of us in Christ Jesus our Lord, for whom there is dominion. And you can just go on and sound like, Lord. He sounds like 4 or 5 Episcopalian priests got in a race to see who could write the longest doxology. And it's usually full of words that are so churchy and theological that almost have meaning, but you have to work to get like glory and honor and dominion and. The Old Testament is about people treating each other poorly or well. It's very down to earth. It's very what about a bad king? All these questions that we all deal with every day. And for me, I'm grateful to have both testaments, because elsewise, by the way, a lot of the things that the Old Testament deals with, the New Testament does not, because I'm convinced that the New Testament authors said, Why should we go over this ground again? We've already got the Old Testament. Right. By the way, on this question of dealing with government, by the New Testament time, it's pretty well settled. Jesus, they bring Jesus the coin and they say, I'm asking about paying taxes, and he says, show me the coin. And it's got an image of Caesar on one side, and on the other side it will say something like, Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord. The early Christian confession, Jesus is Lord. You know all about the emperor cult in Greco-Roman world, do you? That they would proclaim an emperor to be a god. At first after his lifetime, but then they started doing it while he was still alive. And the claim, Caesar is Lord, is a claim to divinity and to absolute lordship over the lives of all the citizens and non-citizens in the Roman Empire. No believing Jew could say that. Right? Caesar is not Lord. And when the early Christians confessed, Jesus is Lord, to us that sounds like a religious statement only, a statement of spirituality. I believe that the Lord Jesus is the Lord of my life. When an early Christian said it, they were saying, and Caesar is not. Therefore. So they brought Jesus that coin, and he said, give Caesar back give it back to him. It's Caesar's, he made it, give it back to him. You render unto God what is God's. And what is that? Your whole life. Your absolute allegiance. There's this image of Caesar on that coin. Where do you find an image of God in the world? We are made in the image of God. The coinage of God's kingdom is not a metal round thing. It is us. Uh-oh, look out. How long do I have? Can I get a full sermon in here? I fit home. Not to let go. 8 minutes. Oh, I'm gonna have to rein it in. I'll just get ready to start getting the altar call at 8 minutes. Yes.
I just have been wondering, because I haven't looked you up. Have you written any narratives, biblical narratives on the Old Testament? You opened the Old Testament.
I think the closest to that would be my humor book. It's called, what's it called? A Time to Laugh, in which I unfold some of the narratives in the Old Testament that are funny. That's another thing. I love the Old Testament because it's so human. And I mean, this is what makes Christianity, by the way, in my view, what makes Christianity and not, say, Islam or something like that. We believe that when God revealed God's self best to humankind, I tell my students, when God really wanted to speak clearly to us, he reared back and spoke a human being. Do you follow me?
Say that again.
He reared back and spoke a human being. What is God's word to us? Jesus is God's word to us. So, go back to Genesis 1. We were created in God's image. All of that business about the interaction, not that word, intersection, closer, between the human and divine. That's what Christianity is about. We believe that our God is a personal God who speaks the person, as is God's best word, who created persons in his image. The highest value, then, is a person. And the highest values are person. In Islam, and I'm not throwing them off, they worship kind of the words of the book. It was dictated, right? And the rules matter more than the person, right? And the personal. That's not Christianity at all. When they got into it with Jesus about harvesting on the Sabbath day, you remember? He said, I am Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, God didn't have this rule he wanted kept and then created us so that we could keep it. God created us and then made some rules to help us live a life that works. Right? Okay. Other questions? There was one more from over here. Yes.
Yes. Forgive me if you've already covered this. a monarchy that is ordained and named by God.
Right.
How is that different than a theocracy?
Ah, thank you. Well, yeah. You know, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of discussion of theocracy, right? Which would be, the definition of that would be direct rule by God. The reason theocracy never works, cannot work, is because God always has to have a spokesman. So, in most of the theocracies of the world, historically and otherwise, historically, it turns out that the priests are the advocates of theocracy, because they say, well, God's going to rule directly, but we will be God's spokespersons. Right. And
So the
that's not-
Vatican is theoretically a
theocracy, yeah, it is, yeah. The Pope doesn't claim to be king, he claims to be the high priest, who knows what God wants us to do.
But, so when the king, the Solomon reigns,
Yeah.
that's say, politics or policy. But do the people, they hear the policy, but do they hear how it is influenced by
See,
the theologians?
Yeah, see, this is one of the things about the history of Israel during this time period. The first discussion we had was about how we call this history, but it's not. And one of the reasons it's not is because we know nothing about David's policies. The Bible doesn't talk about that. We know about Solomon building. We don't know whether they had laws governing
Overtime.
yeah, well, yeah, we did have laws. The king can give you as much overtime as he wants, so there. But we don't know anything about the rest of civil society. How did they deal with, well, one of the things we don't know for sure is about the court system, whether they had one. How did they deal in those days with property disputes? We don't know. And we don't know because the authors aren't interested in those sorts of grainy, everyday things. They're interested in monarchy. So that makes it not a history at all, in a way. It would be as though we knew all about Jefferson and Lincoln and that sort of stuff, but didn't know anything about railroads or civil wars or you know.
There are a couple of people that I've read, and it's been 10 years ago, I can't remember who it was, maybe Friedman, but it talks about the sum of history being the struggle of individuals to learn how to get along with each other and govern ourselves.
Well, you know, why is it? This period of history and this writing about history, also, I mean, it still raises questions that are like that are pertinent today in the consideration of history. Would you say that this material lends itself more to the great man theory or the circumstances and theory of history? This is great man theory, isn't it? It's about David and Solomon. Right. The little person is of no interest much to this story, except that they bear the brunt of what goes wrong when it goes wrong. And we live.
So what's that message?
That's still I mean, we're back to today. Is it? Are you and I going to have any influence on the Korean weapons situation? No. Not a drop.
There's the rub.
We're not going to have. We're going to be finding out about that after the fact. You know, this release of Kennedy papers has the historians all excited, not so much because of the conspiracy theories, but because they're getting insights into the Cold War dynamics that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So they're finding out about Cuba, Russia, those kind of relations, not directly related to the JFK thing at all. So here, how many years is it later? And we still don't know as a population exactly what the dynamics were in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know some of them, but we don't. And at the time, we knew nearly nothing about the inner workings of it. How very close we got.
And the North Korean people will never know.
No. Yes.
I have a question about whether the Bible uses the term slavery or forced labor throughout. Because in U.S. history, slavery was what was called chattel slavery.
Yeah. And the answer to that is, in Hebrew, there is one word that means either servant or slave, and we never know for sure which it is. Right? And there is a word for forced labor, and it does not necessarily imply a condition of slavery. So if you're a slave, you've lost your freedom. Somebody owns you, right? You can be forced into labor and not have lost your absolute freedom. You're just made to work a while, right? And so they're not the same idea. Although, boy, I don't know how you'd know the difference. I always worried about this because it seems to be that they did the 12 tribes by month. So you're in the tribe of Judah, your month is March. Right? What about those couple of tribes whose months were during harvest time?
Every 12th year you lost.
Yeah.
You know, the Incas did the same thing.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Is it safe to assume that?
By the way, time is up. If you need to go, you can go. But
Is it safe to assume that all civilizations that were successful took captives and used them?
all
Or is there an
civilizations
example of a civilization who did not do that?
in that time period in the ancient
Yeah.
world, no, there is not an example of a civilization that didn't take captives and use them as slaves.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, the Israelites were rather, they at least had rules in Deuteronomy and elsewhere, limiting how you could treat someone under circumstances. Mesopotamians did nonsense. Romans even, nonsense.
Please come back and give us a series on the judges.
I'd be like it.
Yeah.
That's what we want to hear, that you're coming back.
Thank you.